In 1994, after a long period of eager anticipation, I was able to get Wraith the Oblivion, first edition. And I've journeyed forward with Wraith since then. It has been a relationship of deep love and appreciation. Now, with the 20th anniversary edition here, let's explore and see if that relationship can continue in love or must change in some way.
21 years ago, when I came to Korea for just 1 year, the only role-playing game I brought with me was Wraith the Oblivion, 2nd edition. Things have expanded a little bit since then. Let's take a look at Chapter 2 of Wraith 20th Anniversary Edition and see how things have changed.
Chapter 1, let's face it, was a little difficult for me. I was, as I said, unimpressed. Chapter 2, on the other hand, is one of those restorations of faith. It's really nice to be going through Wraith and have it be in a full color format, but a full color format that conforms to the actual descriptions of the Wraith setting, right? Bleak, muted colors with flashes of something else, hints, flares, and the potential for the dying of the light. So from just an artistic appreciation standpoint, going through page after page is, I think uplifting is the wrong word, but you know what I mean. Anyway, Chapter 2, setting, is a marked improvement over Chapter 1, introduction. And one thing that keeps occurring to me each time I go through to read and compare to 1st edition and 2nd edition is now we have all these different resources that we can actually use to present different tellings and retellings of the history and the makeup of the world in which a new Wraith will find themselves. It's one thing that is made, or one thing that we should remember about Wraith is the idea that this is primarily a culture dependent on oral tradition. It's quite easy for history to change just with the way that it is told. So, of all the different versions of this that there are, this one is really quite well put together. It's short, it's punchy, it's sometimes too dependent on recycling famous phrases, but then again there is that smile of recognition. It's clear and it's not repetitive. So we have on its first page, which starts on page 25 and will go quite a distance, as you'll see, we get a framing set of 3 paragraphs saying that the world is not our world, but standard to a lot of the World of Darkness games. Then we get into geography and metaphysics, and this is probably the clearest way that this has ever been stated in an official product related to the first runs of the World of Darkness. So geography and metaphysics opens with the Skinlands and talks to us very directly about the balance between the Gothic and the Punk, with some specific examples of what that really means for your description. Well done. Then we move into the Shroud and the Fog. What are they? It's good to have them right here, right up front, so that as you are introducing yourself to the setting, you know that these things exist. They will always be a part of your understanding of how this game works. So, again, good job. Then we move into the Underworld. So we're metaphysically or geographically speaking, we're moving down through the layers, right? So the underworld, and the very first sentence is, the underworld is a collective term for all the realms of the dead, from the shadowlands that border on the lands of the living to the hellish depths of the labyrinth, indescribably far away. The underworld doesn't exist as a singular place. These two sentences already significant, strong opening. This marks the type of writing you're going to experience in this chapter, a very well done chapter. So the underworld, short, gaze upon my works, is an interesting header for a very useful paragraph that doesn't really match the gaze upon my works part, but you know, it gets you in the right mood, I suppose. Then Oblivion, a slightly longer description of Oblivion, again very useful. What is it at its most basic level? That's paragraph 1. A sense of the effects of Oblivion on daily life is paragraph 2. What does Oblivion manifest as physically? If you were to go and search for it, if you were to go down into the labyrinth, for example, what are you going to see? That's the next. And then last is the last paragraph is describing what it's like to approach it. What's there? What are you going to see? What does it feel like? So as a quick gloss over all of these concepts, it's really well done. And the next thing, history of the Dark Kingdom of Iron. Kind of a vague opening paragraph to the history of the Dark Kingdom of Iron. It's more of introducing you, the reader, to the idea of what the word history is going to mean. Then we get a time before time, so before there is a Dark Kingdom of Iron. Then the sundering, the separation of the lands of the living, the lands from the dead, to connect us to the concept of the shroud and the fog and why these things are separated. Then again, we talk about Oblivion. This is a little repetitious, but it's framing us for the Dark Kingdom of Iron's feelings about Oblivion more than anything else. Just on the heels of what we just read, it does feel a little bit, didn't we just look at this? Then we have the labyrinth, and there are some ideas or way of expressing ideas in here which might seem counterintuitive, such as Oblivion giving birth to things. And I think of all the descriptions in here, this might have the weakest descriptions, but the impact remains the same, right? It's not just that Oblivion is like a black hole sucking things in. Oblivion has these tendrils and tentacles extending all through the metaphysics of the underworld, and it has these effects, including things like the Neverborn, the Malfians, and so on and so forth. So be prepared for Oblivion not to just be some isolated place that's slowly sucking things down a cosmic drain. It's in all things. It's even in you, O player character. Then we get to the Lady of Fate. A nice clear description of the Lady of Fate. And that leads us nice and quickly into Charon. And then there's a text box on the Far Shores and Transcendence, which is very helpful for putting those in context when they're introduced a little later. And then it shifts into more of a flow of an oral tradition, right? We have another little boxed item for payment for the dead, and the section on Charon goes into subheaders: the Lady of Fate's tasks and Charon's payment, the ferryman, a very striking piece of half-page art. Then we've got what's called the First Descent. We learn about who Charon is and what he does. We have the rescue of Nudri, the smith, the Grand High Artificer from the labyrinth. We have information on the ferrymen, who are now called the Shining Ones. We just have this flow in order, a chronological order of the development of all things that would eventually become the capital city of the Dark Kingdom of Iron, Stygia. So we have another text box on what soul forging is. We have the founding of the empire and the building of Stygia, the Republic of Stygia, the Golden Age, the decline, all of these things, right? So through this part of the chapter, we see how the underworld inherits fading ideas from the Skinlands, from the land of the living. So as time progresses, the developing society of wraiths take on social constructs that as a mirror of what's happening in the land of the living. So Charon remains a very important figure, and we go through the fall of the Republic. We are introduced to the interesting concept of the maelstroms, these massive underworld shaking storms. We have the tale told one more time of the first great maelstrom. We have something called the resurrection, which is the rebirth of Stygia after its destruction at the hands of the first maelstrom. We have the cracking of this once idyllic society, the ferrymen, those who serve under Charon. They rebel. Why? It's nice and clearly explained so that we can get a very quick handle on some of the deep-seated, right, some of the core conflicts in the setting so that we can begin to plan. As we have noticed in early World of Darkness projects, as you go through, while it's not every paragraph that's seeding you with an idea, significant numbers of ideas are being tossed out. Hey, look at this. Hey, here's friction. Hey, here's conflict. Here's outright rebellion, and so on and so forth. All right, we have a text box about the city and home of the ferryman, the city of Dis. We go into rebuilding of Stygia. We have the fishers, and seeds are planted for the coming conflict with them, well described. We have the Treaty of Paradise. We go into a description of the rise of the hierarchy and the founding of the guilds. The second great maelstrom arrives, why it arrived, what effects it had, right? And those effects are not just physical but also social. And we have a shift in the way that soul forging and its purpose is described. We have the Fisher's Revolt. We have the Code of the Dead. Right? Now we're on page 34. We're just getting like this tidal wave of quick, punchy, clear, useful information. So if I sound positive, I think I should. This is really easy to jump in, remind yourself, what was this again? And to be able to flip through and have it in order so it plays out for you, almost like an encyclopedia or something like that, but an encyclopedia that is entirely interesting to read. Yeah, I think this is very positive. More subheaders: the Great Evacuation, the Rise of the Heretics, the Proclamation of Reason. Right. So, once again, the society of these wraiths in the underworld is being reordered by Charon. The Council of Inquisitors. Stygia besieged by enemies within and without. And then we have a series of 3 terrible sins called the first, second, and third abominations. Right? And these are those great tragedies in the underworld, things that wraiths still talk about to this day, sometimes in like mythological terms, right? Such as the third abomination, the destruction of the Dark Kingdom of Obsidian. Right? So this leads us into the third great maelstrom and all of its effects: social, physical, moral, and spiritual. In the wake of this particular maelstrom, the shroud between the land of the living and the land of the dead thickens even further, giving real teeth and weight to the Code of the Dead, the Dictum Mortuum. So we have more information about the rise of industry. Stygia is now influenced by the concept of the Industrial Revolution and now starts building other outposts, other cities to take the burden off of Stygia. The necropoli begin to extend outward. Right. Now, as we enter the age of industry, we also enter into an age where Charon's vast power begins to be limited. The fetters of Charon and of those death lords that serve under him, they are no longer able to reach the Shadowlands, the reflection of the Skinlands. They're trapped fully in the underworld. And this begins the real decline, the separation, the fragmentation of Wraith society. Instead of being one unified whole within the Dark Kingdom of Iron, now we have these outposts, these separations, and what was mirrored, or it mirrors, the relationship between the British Empire and its colonies, separation, and the beginning of independent politics. So this leads us to the formation of the Doomslayers, and once again Charon has to descend into the labyrinth. And from this point on, Charon is more and more and more hands off, and the connection between that and the social changes in Wraith society are made very, very clear, and so therefore very, very useful to those who would like to create a chronicle or get established in this game. With the rise of World War I, we have another great influx of the dead, which leads to us receiving the fourth great maelstrom, and then the arrival of the Great Depression and influx and increase in spectral attacks. Charon returns, and then we have World War II and the War of the Dead. The Great Kingdom, or the Dark Kingdom of Jade and the Dark Kingdom of Iron, go to war, mirroring the war in the real world. And with the dropping of 2 atomic devices, we get to the 5th Great Maelstrom, the rise of the dread Malfian Gorul, and the disappearance of Charon. All right. In the aftermath of the loss of Charon, what physical, social, and moral effects have we experienced? Now we're on page 41. Then things shift. We move to a new section, Souls and Memories, the Economics of the Underworld. Right? So now they're directly talking to us about the day-to-day existence and elements that makes the unlife or the life of a Wraith in the underworld. So the economics. Do people actually trade in soul-forged oboli, in money? Well, some do, some don't, but there's this sense of barter. This is very clear. Who's affected, how they're affected, social opinion about the economics of the underworld. We get into a clear description of soul forging and the personalities involved. We talk about relics and artifacts, and through this we are also given this very interesting counterpoint. Yes, the soul forges are using actual wraiths of various types to beat them, forge them into useful objects. But at the same time, exploration yields shadows or wraiths or ghosts, memories, ideas of items from the living world. Stygia itself was at one point built from the blocks of destroyed cities. It was defended, right, using the wraiths of once great heroes and their steeds and so on and so forth. Is it really necessary to forge these items? Or should they instead be gathering these items and be more focused on transcendence than endurance? This idea is just thrown out there. It's made clear enough to be useful and not beating you over the head like some kind of meta plot. So after explaining relics and artifacts, they get into clearly what do wraiths want, right, in terms of economics. They get into the money, they get into relic hunting, barter, deals. I really liked this particular section, right, dealing with getting witnesses to deals and being aware and self-aware that the shadow, the Wraith's shadow, is also involved in any deal between two Wraiths. So that's interesting, giving us this very cool slogan to say, every deal between two is between four. I like that a lot. Then we get into Stygian Steel. What is it? Why do I care? Then we shift into the metaphysics with probably the clearest description of the call we've seen to date, and what it is to manifest for the first time as a Wraith. So that's fantastic. A good description of Corpus, the Wraith's body, and we get into reaping and reapers and thralls, and finally on page 47 we get into masks. Now masks have been referenced in the history section of the setting chapter, but here they are described clearly, and again lots of hooks are provided, right, about who does and who doesn't wear them. What is a drone and why are they important? What are death marks and why are they important? What is the relationship really conceptually between the psyche and the shadow? We've talked about passions and not being passionate enough. We've talked about fetters and fetters being destroyed. But what are they? Well, it's right here on page 48. That's quite a long section, and it's a very useful section on getting the concept of passions and fetters, how they relate to roleplay, how they relate to the society as an actual thing that people talk about in the society. It's good. It puts out very clearly Wraiths, passions, and fetters can change in two basic ways, right? So although we might have this sense of the enduring, right, eternal kind of trapped between life and final reward kind of Wraith character, Wraiths do change over time, and the change is a result of the pressures upon them. So we could resolve passions and fetters, or they could be destroyed, wiped out, or killed. What does that really mean? And how does this relate to what you're actually going to say in character about these things? We have a similar thing for catharsis and harrowings. Right? If you're unfamiliar with Wraith, a lot of what I'm saying now is probably just coming out as gibberish. Like, what are all these terms for? Well, that's why you get and read the book, so you can enjoy it like I do. Wraith is full of very rich ideas to explore. It's much, much more, I think, than people imagine when they just look at the cover. All right. Now we move into a deep overview of Stygia, starting at the very, very bottom of page 49. And this includes an actual color map, right? Not a bright kind of like Google Maps map, but a very wraithly, ghostly, and pleasing looking map. What is it like to approach the city? What is it like to approach the city by river, by rail? What are the features of its landscape and seascape? What are the major features that people talk about and can easily see, have heard about? Right? We have our map splitting up this section. It's a 2-page spread. It's fantastic. I love it. And its color scheme is very evocative of the covers from 2nd edition. Then we have the ever-drowning city, which I like, as it talks about Stygian architecture extending far out to sea and far below surface level. Right. We have the districts. As we go through the map, and the map is annotated with these different districts and famous sites, we're going to have a gazetteer that takes us through each of these sites, the different districts, the lower bay, the upper bay, the riverside, Onyx Point, Ironville, the Spine, Hangtown, Sanctuary, Newtown, Wilestown, South End, Iron Hills. They walk us through all of that, and then we move into a description of what necropoli really are, what we're going to find in them generally, and then they take us to notable necropoli, starting with Edinburgh. All right. And then LA, Paris, lots about Paris, Philadelphia, not so much about Philadelphia, Rome, same amount about Rome, and then having given us these samples in different parts of the world so that we can either use them or use them as a template for our own. They give us the political structures, the ranks within a necropolis, what factions might be represented and how they are going to behave, renegades, a list of famous renegade gangs, some classic returned art. Okay, this goes on for a couple of pages. Then the heretics, notable heretic cults, how we should think about them, the hierarchy, right? The ferryman. Right? So each of these in context of the necropoli, the Midnight Express, the train that runs between all of these areas, the legions and their military duties, civilian duties, legion rank, what legions there are and what they do. Okay. Tons and tons and tons of stuff. Right? Each legion is gone through in detail. The Emerald Legion, the Skeletal Legion, and the Grim Legion, the Legion of Fate, the Iron Legion, the Legion of Paupers, the Penitent Legion, the Silent Legion, and as I said, the Skeletal Legion. These things are described so that you can make use of them both for conversation and for comprehension and plotting and planning and all this stuff. What do the different legions think of other legions? All right. This brings us to what we've been waiting for, the guilds. And one of the sad things about Wraith 2nd Edition was that the line ended before the description of all the guilds and the people that fall into those guilds were completed. Well, now they have been. We've got the guilds. And what are the guilds? What are the nature of guilds? What is the feeling or effect of guilds? How are they affected by the different great events in the history that we now understand because we've read it, right? The breaking of the guilds, life on the fringe, the guilds in modern Stygia, organization. If you're not in it and you're looking in, what is that like? And then there's a reference to the Nemoi, right? Who are the forbidden guild that no one can quite remember because they deal with memory. And that brings us to page 93 and ends setting. So quite a packed overview, benefiting from all the other products that have been released for Wraith 1st and 2nd Edition prior to it, now organized all in one place and contextualized so that you have a sense of the time and place, the social structures, the moral and the moral viewpoint and moral outrage and so on and so forth that are shaping or can shape or can be balanced to shape whatever it is that you are looking to do with Wraith. So chapter 2, setting, very happy. The next installment, we take a look at chapter 3, which is likely going to be a shorter one than this because it's dealing with the rules, and rules are the rules. Until next time.